1:47 hours. At 59 degrees north in the Baltic Sea, the container ship Baltic Spirit suddenly vanished from the map. Its AIS transponder went offline, and 15,000 tons of steel slipped into silence just 800 meters from Estonian territorial waters. Moments later, a supply vessel moved in and began transferring high-pressure fuel through a 12-inch pipe under the cover of darkness. Far above, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon captured the entire scene through its long-range infrared system. But instead of moving in, the crew received a strange order. Hold position, do not engage, do not fire. So why would a force as powerful as the United States simply watch this unfold in real time? What made it even more unsettling was what waited below. Hidden beneath the supply ship was a Russian Kilo-class submarine, one of the quietest submarines in the world, lying in ambush with its launch systems already prepared. It had been waiting there, ready for anything that came too close. On the surface, it looked like Russia had every angle covered. But what they did not realize was that the U.S. had already set something extraordinary in motion. No missile exchange, no artillery duel, no move anyone expected. The real answer was hidden in the next few minutes of this standoff. Go back 1 hour to 0:47. The P-8 Poseidon's discovery of the Kilo submarine was not luck. Before the Baltic Spirit cut its AIS, a fiber optic sensor network on the seabed picked up a faint pressure change, the kind created when a diesel-electric submarine shifts into silent running mode. In response, the P-8 dropped a chain of multi-static sonobuoys. Working together, they formed narrow digital sound beams capable of cutting through the electromagnetic interference coming from Kaliningrad. What they revealed sent alarm through NATO command. The Kilo was sitting motionless, fully alert, with launch tubes 1 and 2 already open. At the same time, Russia released mobile acoustic decoys, creating dozens of phantom underwater contacts crawling along the floor of the Gulf of Finland. Any attempt to identify the real submarine became almost impossible. On the surface, the refueling point had been chosen with precision, exactly 800 meters from Estonian waters. Close enough to use Naissaar Island as a natural barrier against waves, giving stability to the delicate high-pressure fuel transfer. One outside disruption, one rupture in that line, and 840 tons of diesel could spill into the sea. Russia was counting on NATO refusing to risk an environmental disaster, especially in international waters where legal limits would slow any direct response. Moscow believed it controlled everything: the sea surface, the signal environment, and the pace of escalation. From their point of view, NATO had only two options: watch quietly or trigger a disaster. What they never imagined was a third option already being activated by the U.S. Navy. One designed to turn that entire layered defense into dead weight without firing a single round. By 2:15, the countdown showed only 25 minutes left. Then the stillness broke. A brief coded message from the U.S. 6th Fleet reached Estonian command. Action authorized, move now. The Estonian patrol vessel Raju surged forward through the waves, racing toward the 800-meter line, fully ready. Above, commando helicopters dropped to just 100 meters, blasting searchlights across the deck of the Baltic Spirit. A night boarding attempt had begun. Russia, however, had anticipated exactly this kind of move. The moment Raju crossed within 1,200 meters, the Podlet K system aboard the Baltic Spirit shifted into focused, high-power jamming. Radar screens and radio links aboard the Estonian vessel dissolved into static. Then fire monitors on the Russian ship sprayed intense streams of water, building a curtain of steam that blinded the helicopter's infrared view. Below the surface, the Kilo submarine added another layer. It launched a wire-guided underwater drone from one of its tubes. Moving at 40 knots and linked by an ultra-thin fiber optic tether, it gave off no electromagnetic signature at all, making it nearly invisible to Estonian sensors. The drone slipped in behind Raju and deployed a high-strength polymer cable net. Seconds later, the Estonian vessel's engine screamed under strain and stopped cold. The alarm echoed across the deck. Propeller fouled, engine overload. In an instant, the 900-ton patrol ship became a drifting steel shell, helpless in front of the very force it had tried to intercept. Russia had neutralized NATO's intervention attempt without using a single explosive. Then, as shock spread through the Estonian crew, a new American order came through. Withdraw all units, return to base immediately. Estonia pulled its remaining forces back toward shore. Overhead, the P-8 Poseidon kept circling in silence, watching everything but offering no visible support. To Russia, it looked like proof that NATO had backed down in the face of submarine power. But that silence hid something far more dangerous. A larger game was in motion, and everything so far had been part of the setup. At 2:40, after the Estonian patrol craft had been disabled and forced away, the sea fell quiet again. Moscow sent no radio traffic, maintaining strict electromagnetic silence to preserve the Baltic Spirit's civilian cover. But above and below the surface, the pressure was rising fast. From the direction of Kaliningrad, the Steregushchi-class missile frigate Subrazitelny accelerated to 28 knots and headed straight for the refueling point. It moved with no navigation lights and no radio warnings. Its only message came through its fire control radar, which locked directly onto the American P-8. Inside the Poseidon cockpit, the warning flashed red again and again. It was a clear signal. Any interference from the air would be met immediately. At the same moment, Russian Su-30SM fighters burst out from behind Nisar Island and skimmed just 30 meters above the sea, roaring straight over the NATO formation. The shockwaves cracked overhead, pressing hard on the nerves of the Estonian sailors below. Russia was executing a mobile anti-access strategy. Surround the target with military force, but preserve enough diplomatic ambiguity to claim it was all just a routine exercise in international waters. On the deck of the Baltic Spirit, the refueling entered its last 15 minutes. To complicate long-range tracking, Russia launched a digital deception move. Autonomous buoys fitted with corner reflectors were dropped into the water. Instantly, NATO radar screens filled with dozens of identical contacts spreading in all directions like a school of fish. The real Baltic Spirit disappeared inside a maze of false returns. To any conventional guidance system, the target had effectively dissolved. With 15 minutes left, Russia believed the contest was over. The P-8 still orbiting at a distance looked like surrender. But what the Russians did not realize was that the aggressive activation of Subrazitelny's full radar and control systems had finally handed the Americans exactly what they had been waiting for. The weak point in the Russian defense architecture was now mapped and stored inside the P-8's processors. The Silent Hammer protocol, a stealth strike aimed not at armor or hulls, but at the enemy's control systems, was now ready to unfold. At 2:52, while Subrazitelny kept its lock on the P-8, the U.S. Navy initiated its move. The target was not the ship itself, but the data streams Russia depended on. Every pulse from the Podlet K jammer, every frequency-hopping pattern, every connection between the frigate and the merchant vessel was now being measured in real time. The P-8 transmitted an ultra-short synchronization signal precisely aligned with the Podlet K pulse rhythm. The first effect appeared inside the Russian squadron's positioning system. Exploiting a gap in the link protocol between Subrazitelny and the Baltic Spirit, the U.S. carried out a high-level spoofing operation. Russian GLONASS data was shifted by only a few milliseconds. Just enough to matter, not enough to raise suspicion. The frigate's autopilot now believed it was 2 nautical miles clear of the Baltic Spirit. In reality, the two ships were closing toward each other on a direct collision path. By projecting power so aggressively, Russia had unknowingly opened an electronic corridor straight into the heart of its own navigation system. Below the surface, the USS New Jersey, SSN 796, joined in. It deployed what amounted to an acoustic logic bomb, a device broadcasting a specialized frequency pattern that precisely imitated the control signals used by Russia's fiber-optic underwater drones. The drone received the false instructions as if they were authentic. Instead of continuing its mission, it retracted its polymer net and turned sharply back, fouling the propellers of the hidden Kilo submarine itself. The most critical move, however, centered on the refueling operation. The U.S. Navy directed an infrared laser at the pressure sensor on the 12-inch fuel line. The beam did not ignite anything. Instead, it created thermal spoofing, making the control system believe internal pressure was climbing rapidly toward a catastrophic threshold. In line with Russia's own emergency safety rules, the fuel transfer system immediately triggered an automatic shutdown. In just 2 minutes, the U.S. turned Russia's advantage into paralysis without firing a shot. The Kilo submarine was trapped by its own drone. The frigate lost true positioning. The Baltic Spirit's fuel operation was frozen by its own protection system. Russian radar and control systems still showed normal conditions, but in reality, the entire operation had stalled. And that opened the way for the final enforcement phase, one Russia could no longer block or deny. At 3:04, a collision alarm suddenly blared aboard Subrazitelny. Misled by corrupted GLONASS data, the warship was racing straight toward the Baltic Spirit at 28 knots. Only 300 meters remained. The captain had no choice but to cut electronic control and wrench the ship into a hard manual turn. The frigate rolled 30 degrees and narrowly avoided smashing into the merchant vessel. Underwater, the Kilo submarine was in even worse condition. Its own drone had tangled its propellers, and the overloaded engines were now producing a sonar signature loud enough to echo across the Gulf of Finland. The USS New Jersey moved directly above it and transmitted a sonar warning. Surface immediately to avoid a catastrophic leak. At the same time, American unmanned underwater vehicles approached the Baltic Spirit's hull. Using penetrating ultrasonic sensors, they captured live images of missile components hidden inside the containers and broadcast that footage over an unencrypted international frequency. In that moment, Russia's plausible deniability collapsed. Russian Su-30SM fighters dropped low, preparing to eliminate the evidence by force. But they were immediately met by targeting locks from a NATO F-35B formation. For a few breathless moments, the two powers stood at the edge of full-scale confrontation above a sea turned into a diesel powder keg. Russia now had only two choices: escalate and risk overwhelming consequences, or pull back and lose the shipment. At 3:15, the Kilo submarine surfaced, disabled by propeller failure and exposed in the act of shielding a smuggling operation. The escort frigate Subrazitelny, no longer in control of the situation, withdrew 1 nautical mile as Estonian special forces closed in on the Baltic Spirit under U.S. Navy protection. Not a single shot had been fired, and yet Russia's entire layered defense, from long-range intimidation to electronic shielding, had been broken apart by the Silent Hammer Protocol. By dawn, the operation was over. Russian units pulled back toward Kaliningrad, later explaining the retreat as the result of technical trouble aboard the ship. The Baltic Spirit was escorted to Tallinn, where 40 containers of military components were seized. The U.S. Navy quietly recovered electronic warfare equipment and made no public victory announcement. The Shadow Fleet remained, but its code, its methods, and its playbook had been exposed. This confrontation in the Baltic did not end with explosions. It ended with a demonstration that modern power is no longer measured only by firepower, but by the ability to reach inside an opponent's systems and take control without warning. The sea grew calm again, but underneath that calm, both sides were already preparing for the next hidden clash, this time farther north, beneath the Arctic ice.